นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening. When I was a junior monk staying at Ajahn Chah's monastery, one of the ways the monks would talk about each other was they'd say, could tell a new monk, as it were, someone who is new to the practice. And that doesn't necessarily mean new in time only or freshly arrived. It can also mean someone who hasn't yet perhaps fully gained mastery of their mind, you could say. You could tell the difference between someone who is new and then someone who is older or experienced in the practice. You might call an elder. It's one of the terms we use in monasteries. And the way you would tell the difference is that the newcomer would still complain. Complain about things. Utter words of complaint. Bring out complaints verbally. And the elder, the experienced one, would not. This may be a very simplistic generalization, but it seemed to apply in most cases. The monks who had been practicing for a while and gained a certain measure of restraint, self-control, equanimity, peace of mind, they'd never complain, whatever the conditions. And sometimes the conditions could be quite harsh, like weather and food, and sometimes we had to do a lot of work, sometimes didn't get so much sleep, and so on. Sometimes conditions could be harsh, not all the time, but they wouldn't complain. And the newcomer may be just the slightest little thing and already complaints, raised eyebrows, quiet comments, occasionally large dramatic verbal outbursts, I guess. So sometimes people ask, well, what results can you expect from practicing Buddhist meditation and living, if only temporarily or long-term, in a Buddhist monastery? What can you expect? So that's one way of measuring it, I guess you could say. You learn not to complain so much. Perhaps there's a caveat, you could say. You learn time and place as well, the right time to voice your complaint, your grumble, your irritation. So they'll even more experienced monks may still have a few things they want to say, but they would voice them at the right time, in the right way, in the right place, rather than in an unrestrained way just blurting out whatever's on their mind, because that was always seen as a sign of inexperience in the practice, not so much mindfulness, not so much awareness of oneself. Our teacher, Luang Por Chah, emphasized the quality of kindness and compassion what we call Brahma Vihara Dhamma, as central to just developing oneself in the Buddhist path, or we say practicing Dhamma, or developing the Dhamma. But in particular in a monastery, because you live as a community in a monastery, whether it's just 2 or 3 or many, 20, 30, 40 or 100. You need the qualities of kindness and compassion so that you can live together successfully. And successfully in Buddhist monasticism means you're relatively harmonious, cooperative, helpful to each other, so that you're not endlessly dealing with quarrels and disputes and problems, so that each individual can benefit from the harmony and get on with their meditation. So metta, karuna are essential qualities that we put effort into developing every day. Just like any form of meditation, just like any aspect of the monastic training, the discipline, renunciation, simplicity, developing effort to be wakeful and mindful, all of this requires effort. And in the same way, practice of metta, goodwill, and karuna, compassion, requires effort. Sometimes you have it, sometimes you lose it. When you lose it, then you have to get it back again, and that requires effort, especially if there's a lot of pressure or particular situation draws your metta away or takes it away, then you have to get it back again. And that will require effort, maybe a lot of effort. You notice in the Buddhist teachings, whether you're a layperson or a monastic, these qualities are at the very center of experience, living in the world, living with other people. If you take the 5 precepts, how do you keep the 5 precepts on a daily basis? Well, you have to have metta. You undertake not to kill or harm living beings. That means in whatever situation you may be tempted to kill or harm, you don't. So there has to be some level of kindness and compassion, supporting restrained behavior. Same with undertaking to refrain from taking what is not given. Usually we translate that as stealing, but it means you have to have a certain respect for other people's property or what is not yours, and leave it alone, basically. That requires kindness towards others. In a monastery, we go one step further. We don't just not steal, but we also look after each other's property. So, if, say, somebody forgets their wallet or purse or some item that's important to them or valuable to them, then if you're living in a monastery, you actually look after it for the person until you can get it back to them, or at least let them know where it is. It's the one time monks get to handle money. Somebody drops their money, you can pick it up in a monastery. And the Buddha said you should pick it up to look after for them. Same with the 3rd precept, refraining from sexual misconduct. It mainly means leaving people alone who have someone else who are concerned for them. But usually that means you're not playing around with another person's partner, not cheating. It could be not playing around with somebody's child or somebody who's vulnerable. There's different scenarios. but it requires kindness and compassion. You respect your own relations if you're in a relationship, partnership, married, and to respect other people's relationships. Same with speech, to undertake not to lie or speak in a way that sets people apart, divides them up, turns them against each other. You need kindness and compassion. And same even with refraining from intoxicants. Mainly that's a compassion for yourself, because based on the understanding, when you're intoxicated, you do things that hurt yourself and quite often others as well. So you maintain your sobriety, and therefore you can maintain mindfulness, therefore you can look after your own behavior, maybe look after other people as well. In the monastery we have many more rules, more precepts, but it's the same principle. You're learning to protect and guard over yourself, others, and cultivate these qualities of kindness and compassion. One of the terms you hear in a Thai monastery, say Ajahn Chah's monastery, is Greng Jai. Jai means heart or mind. Greng means difficult one to translate in one word. You could say it means being considerate or thoughtful of others. So say one of those new monks or new lay people to the monastery, if they were doing something that was disturbing others or causing a problem for others, they might say, oh, this person, they have no Greng Jai. They're not considerate of others. Maybe it's normal, like you come into the monastery in the beginning, you're still following your own views and opinions and habits and ways of doing things. That's just to be expected because you're untrained, you're new. But then because you're in a new place, the expectation is, well, you at least take some time to learn and find out what you're supposed to do and how things are done and how the monastery is run and what the program is, what the schedule is, where you should be at any time, and then the right way of doing things. A lot of your early years is doing that, finding out. So if someone is not interested, they're not considerate of others, they're not considerate of the wider community, they tend to have issues or problems. So they'll say, oh, that person, they're not considerate of others. So maybe they just want to do things their own way. So maybe they don't follow the monastic daily routine, so they don't turn up for a meeting. Or if they're assigned a chore, they only do the bit that they're willing to do, and the bit they don't really like they might avoid or not do. Monastic training is based largely on trust. It's not like a paid job where you got a job description. If you're not willing to do the job, they'll probably let you go, because there's no point having you there if you're not going to do the job you're being paid for. In monastery, it's based on trust. You're there voluntarily. So of course people's, what we call mental defilements, their kilesas will come into their behaviour sometimes, especially if you're new. It may just be habit, and you have to get out of that habit. Maybe you like lying in the morning. It's a common one. So in Ajahn Chah's monastery, the wake-up bell was at 3 a.m. So there'll be those who get up and get out to the meeting, and then there'll be those who wake up from the bell and then roll over and carry on sleeping. Or sometimes there's group activities, like you clean the dining hall. Usually used to do it together, sweep, mop, set out water and spittoons, just like you read in the Vinaya in the time of the Buddha. But then some monks would do it, some wouldn't. They just turn up on their own time. They'd eat their meal, of course, but they'd just turn up, having let other people do all the cleaning and preparation. Ajahn Chah would say, well, those who do it, they gain something. Those who don't do it, they lose something. What do you gain? Well, you gain your own personal discipline, your ability to train yourself, some energy, some self-respect maybe. If you don't do it, then you lose out on that. And maybe you are doing some parts of the practice but choosing not to do others. So in the long run, you may be lacking in areas of your practice, lacking in mindfulness, lacking in effort, lacking even in understanding. You lose. With speech, then, this one of complaining, not complaining, was quite often you might say, a judge of character. So the monk who's still complaining, why do we have to get up early? Why do we have to do this job? Oh, it's so hot. Oh, why isn't the food different? Why isn't this? Why isn't that? Then the older experienced monks would chuckle, usually meet it with metta, goodwill, and just chuckle. Maybe because they'd been through exactly the same thing. And they know, oh yeah, a new guy, still complaining. But if you keep practicing, cultivating mindfulness, then the complaints start to fade because you realize it doesn't change much, doesn't help, it only makes you more unhappy inside and your mind more restless, more agitated. As you meditate, you realize that not only maybe do you have to let go of the complaints on the outside, you let go on the inside as well. It won't change the conditions. If it's hot, it's still hot, whether you complain or not. But your mind maybe is in a better place when you stop complaining. And the heat maybe is more tolerable. And part of the suffering of life is not so much the thing we encounter, the weather or the person or the tiredness or the job, is what we think about it. And if you get caught into negative thinking, you suffer. If you can be mindful enough to remove that from your experience, well then you don't suffer. Ajahn Chah used to have a lot of compassion for the foreign monks because they came a long way to be there. And quite often they were under extra pressure because they weren't on familiar territory. The weather was different, the food was different, culture and language different. So he'd give them a lot of time and encouragement. Perhaps his main teaching in the beginning, other than encouraging people to be mindful and aware of their own minds, was also just be patient with the conditions, with your own mind, with the situation. Because he couldn't change anything, he couldn't change the way the monastery was, the way the culture, the climate was. So with things you can't change, you might as well be patient. And patient means keeping mindful and keeping your mind in a wholesome state while you encounter the difficulties, while you're going through the difficulties. So patience was a valid, valuable quality that everyone was encouraged to develop. When you lose your patience, what do? You start falling into the negativity, the complaining. One of the things you tend to do is look for the scapegoat or the one to blame. You react with negativity, so it's always the fault of something or somebody. So a common one was, life is suffering. You hear that, a lot of Buddhists will say that. They say, oh, life is suffering. So Ajahn Chah would, if somebody said that, get them to pause and think a little bit more, be more reflective and say, well, is the problem life, or is it what you think about life? And what you think about life means what you're clinging to in your mind. You know, the technical term is upadana, means clinging or attachment. Everybody is here because they've been born, so everyone is experiencing life, but not everyone is suffering with life. So life itself is not necessarily the problem. It may be how you think about life, how you treat life, how you treat yourself, other people, how you look at things. So he uses, if you're suffering, look closely for where you're attaching or clinging. And that's where you can reduce and maybe abandon your suffering. Where does attachment come from? It comes from wanting, desire, negative desire, or what we call craving. Wanting things, wanting pleasure, wanting things to be better than they are, different than they are. And then of course not wanting things you don't like, not wanting the unpleasant experiences. Craving and attachment, they feed each other, but attachment, clinging is like craving as it intensifies. But then where does you find craving comes from? You search backwards in your experience and you'll find what comes from unawareness. That's why we have this experience. It seems to come out of the blue. One moment you're fine, and the next moment suddenly you're caught into reacting in some way. You're discontent and want something you haven't got, or you're upset, dissatisfied with what you have got. So unawareness in Buddhism is ignorance, is avijja. Means without, vicca means knowledge. So without knowledge of the way things are, craving comes up. Craving supports upadana, clinging. And clinging leads on to the way we do things, the way we think, the way we speak, act, our kind of world. We call that becoming or existence. The quality of our existence, the quality of our becoming is determined by craving and attachment. The ones who have practiced the path, or have developed mindfulness and insight and looked into this more closely, probably for a long time, and in a very thorough way, they reduce their craving and clinging, so becoming is also reduced, so then the causes for suffering are reduced. Ones who reach Nibbana, they've done it completely remove craving and attachment from their mind. But they're still alive. That's the point. Like, if you train and learn this Buddhist path all the way to Nibbana, the goal, the highest, it doesn't mean to say you end your life there. It just means you end craving and clinging. Craving and attachment. So if you believe somebody to be, say, an enlightened teacher like Ajahn Chah, then the belief is he's without attachment, without clinging. But he's still alive until the end of his life. So then life itself is not really the problem. It's the clinging, the attachment, that's the problem. That's what we have to identify and recognize. That's what we're doing in our practice, whether we're on the meditation cushion or walking meditation or just going about our business. Where is the craving and the clinging? Because where there's craving and clinging, there'll be suffering. immediately, quickly. So if it's fed by unawareness, avijja, we need to develop awareness, knowledge, mindfulness, clarity, understanding. So if you keep developing mindfulness and the reflectiveness of the mind, then avijja will get less. So the Buddhist way to deal with suffering is identify its source and then abandon the source, the cause. It's not to end up taking your own life or destroy anything, but it's to remove clinging and attachment from your mind. But the enlightened one is still alive, and they can do a lot of good for the world like the Buddha. So the Buddha would go around teaching this method, explaining it to people who seem to be open and ready. Their faculties were developed well enough so that they were ready to hear it and learn it and then practice for themselves. Even the Buddha had to discern between those who were ready to hear the teaching and those who may be so stuck in their ways, so attached to their views that they don't want to listen, don't want to accept any new ideas, new teaching. The Buddha would walk around India barefoot, teaching the Dhamma, teaching this way. But it's not like he somehow escaped life. Far from it. He was, you might say, living life to the full. He had previously had a life of comfort, privilege, power, the best of everything, and a father, parents who loved him and wanted him to be the next ruler of that part of India. He gave all that up to live as a monk, walk barefoot, eating alms food, which probably wasn't always that great, walking around India, practicing. It's hardly that the Buddha was sort of living this kind of privileged, easy life as a spiritual teacher. He was very humble. He walked barefoot, ate alms food. He wore rag robes gathered from corpses. So his robes probably didn't look that good. Very simple medicine if he got ill, still had aches and pains, still got hot, still got dusty, sweaty, still had people come up to him and scold him for being lazy, being an alms mendicant, a beggar, dependent on other people. So some people don't like that. They just say, oh, you're lazy. Some people jealous of him, some people even trying to kill him. So it's not as if his life was kind of all easy peasy after being enlightened. He had to face all kinds of unpleasant conditions, but you can assume the Buddha didn't complain. He wasn't a newbie. Once he was enlightened, he was restrained enough to know these are just the conditions of the world, and without craving and attachment, he didn't create suffering out of them. He's actually very good at turning suffering into compassion and wisdom. He'd done it for himself, so he knew how to do it. So then when other people had their suffering, he could point it out to them where they were going wrong and getting them to reflect so that they could do the same as he had, turn suffering into food for wisdom, insight, and letting go of attachment. Like the farmer who scolded him for begging and saying, I have to work every day, ploughing the fields. What do? You just walk around asking people for food, collecting free food. And the Buddha is very smart. He said, oh, but you're a farmer, I'm also a farmer. Which got the guy's attention because he knew he was a monk. So he said, well, how are you a farmer? So then the Buddha explains that his plough and his yoke of the oxen and the rope and the goad for the oxen, these are all different Dhamma qualities. His patience, his effort, his mindfulness, his restraint. This act of ploughing the fields, sowing the seeds for the crops, gathering the crops, what a farmer does, the Buddha also does through his practice. But it's you call it a spiritual farming, but actually with a better result, because the result for the Buddha is a mind free from suffering, whereas the farmer may be wealthy, the one who had scolded him was scolding him because he was wealthy. The farmer was wealthy, but he still had lots of suffering, worrying about his oxen and his equipment and having to pay his workers, pay the bills. So he had lots of pride, but he also had lots of suffering. Whereas the Buddha was very humble, but no suffering. That's typical of the Buddha's life. He had to endure other people's disparaging remarks, sometimes disrespectful, putting him down, but he just turned it into Dhamma. He's like some kind of amazing spiritual machine that just turns every bit of suffering into something good, wisdom and understanding. And using this method, where's the attachment? If the Buddha had been still attached, still conditioned by ignorance, then it would be, oh, they're scolding me, oh, poor me. You'd start complaining, teach all these people and they still just scold me. My life is still so difficult, walking around barefoot, not very good food, sleeping on a simple mat on the ground, heat, cold, etc., 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 the way the complaining mind goes. That would have been the Buddha if he hadn't let go of his clinging and his attachment. Of course he had. Not only that, he could teach other people how to do it, so he was speaking from personal experience. He wasn't just theorizing, he had done it, so he knows it works. So when we say, oh, life is suffering, what we really mean is there is suffering in life, but the problem is not life, the problem is upadana, clinging, attachment. Until you've seen that, then you keep suffering. Until you've seen it, until you've started abandoning upadana, clinging, attachment, you won't go beyond suffering. What we tend to do is just change things around, so we kind of forget the suffering, forget yesterday's suffering, have a few new experiences today, a few pleasures today to kind of keep ahead of it, but we don't really get to the root cause. So of course it keeps re-emerging out of our ignorance. We keep getting irritated, angry, worried, complaining, obsessed with desires, and not peaceful. So that's one of the modern problems now. We're wealthier, materially wealthier, maybe don't have to work quite so hard as the farmer now. Now you can work from home, you've got a computer, maybe 4 days a week, or even if you don't have a job, you still get some money from the government, or you have savings. Now our problem is that we're so comfortable we can keep distracting ourselves to get away from the suffering or change the experience rather than looking at where it's really coming from. I remember talking to one of the rice farmers, the villagers in northeast Thailand where Ajahn lived, and he said, well, you wealthy people, because he knew I came from a city, you wealthy people, that your problem is you've got too much time on your hands because you can, your job maybe is a more service type job, or you're using intellectual knowledge to do a job. You have more free time, get more money. Your problem is that you've got too much time on your hands, so you think too much, so you get caught into arguments, and your arguments lead to conflicts and discontent, maybe even to wars. Whereas the humble rice farmer hasn't got time for all that. He's just got to get out there and plough the field and harvest the crop. So sometimes, our goal generally in society now is make everyone wealthy, good education, good housing, good Medicare, have enough money to travel. Used to be try and go on holiday once a year, now it's how many times a year can you go abroad or whatever. Someone was saying, oh yeah, I can only go abroad twice a year now. That's our problem. We've got so much that we can take it for granted or get lost, and we forget the Dhamma, we forget the practice. Whether you have a lot or a little, still the problem remains the same. Suffering comes from upadana, clinging and attachment, not life. Not the world. The world, everyone says the world has problems, life has problems. Upadana is the problem. So anytime you are mindful enough, insightful enough to let go of upadana, you'll be doing yourself a favour and other people. It's good for us, good for others. So maybe I'll leave you with those reflections tonight. And we can end the meeting here.